So here we are, 25th anniversary for Heartland Presbyterian Church, a kickoff for our season of celebration. We picked this Sunday because it was the closest in date to January 21st, 1995. And I don't quite know, I've kind of gotten confusing. I've heard 87 members, 87 plus some kids, 93, 111, I guess, whatever it comes up with, gathered and became charter members of Heartland Presbyterian Church. And a committee in the church has been hard at work this past year identifying various things that will be coming in the coming weeks. But I know one of the interesting questions that arose for me, it may seem a strange one, but it was an interesting question to me, in that in picking today's date, we assume Heartland Church didn't become a church until 1995. Think about that. Was it not a church before then? When was the question that I kind of wrestled with. When does a church become a church? It's kind of like you're married before you're married, if you know what I mean, right? So when does a church become a church? Because I think it says something, not just simply as a philosophical, theological question, but it says something about what you believe a church really is. It says something when a church becomes a church. Does a church become a church when you sign the dotted line? Or back in the mid-1980s, there was this evangelism committee of the Presbyterian of Des Moines who had this idea, this vision of a new possible church that might happen in the West Des Moines, Clyde, Waukee area, a growing area. And so they came up with an idea of planting the church there. Is that when the church started? Well, the church is not an idea, so probably not. And then here's some other interesting dates. It was, I believe, in early 1990s that the Presbyterian of Des Moines purchased property at 142nd and Hickman. Is that when the church formed? Well, we know the church is not a location. It was not a building. But even though sometimes what we often say to each other is, hey, I'm going to church. We know a church is not a location or building. So no, that couldn't be when the church becomes a church. When did Heartland become Heartland? Well, was it when they hired, let me make sure I get this date, 1991, when they identified and hired an organizing pastor named Dale Strong? Is that when it started becoming a church? Well, there's some egotistical pastors who believe that maybe they are the church, but I think most of us would say the pastor isn't the church. Well, was it in the following year? Hired Barb Nish as music director. Was it when they had their first worship service, which happened on an Easter morning in April, 1992, I believe? Is that when Heartland became a church? Actually, a year or two before then, there was a group that gathered in the home of Dale and Helen Strong. 17 people. Is that when they became the church, Heartland Church? Anybody here one of the 17? Barb and Andy. Huh? Bob Finney might have been? 1994. So, is that when it became? Well, I think that's closer, it feels like. Or was it that first worship service? Yet a church ultimately is not a worship service. So when did Heartland come into being? Maybe it was actually later that year, after that first initial worship service on Easter morning, when it actually got the name Heartland Presbyterian Church. There's an article on our display out there that says there was a lot of confusion in West Des Moines, Clive, Waukee, because there were a couple of Presbyterian denominations starting new churches. And there was a lot of confusion about who that was. Well, maybe that's when Heartland came into being. Or maybe it was in the years just following that, and this is what I think most Presbyterians think, is because that's when this new community began to identify committees. Right? God knows you can't be a church. Presbyterians, you get two Presbyterians together, they form 3 committees. But it was in those days that they began to form the Presbyterian women. You can't have a church. It's not really a church until you have Presbyterian women, and I swear that. There was a building committee. There was a Christian ed committee. That's when Heartland became a church, right? It's actually a really interesting question, because when did Heartland become Heartland? Was it on that Sunday 25 years ago because a group of people gathered together and raised their hand and signed a document and said, "We are the church"? I think I'm all right with that, because I think it says something about what it means to be the church. The church is not an idea. It's not a concept. It's not a theological idea. The church is not a location. It's not a building. The church is not a program or a committee. The church is not even a worship service. You know what the church is? It's a group of people who hold up their hand and say, "We are the church." 25 years ago, a group of people raised their hand and said, "We are called to be the church." Now, this passage I read from 1 Peter, it can be kind of troublesome. There's a lot I like about it, but there's also a sense in which the descriptors for what it means to be the church. It talks about a holy nation, a royal priesthood. It uses these words that I'm quite uncomfortable with. Yet it's conveying this idea of what the church is that actually challenges some of our cultural assumptions. Because what it's saying is, it's not simply about people coming together and raising their hand and saying, "I commit, I am the church." That's an important part of it. But the reality is, that assertion is, you are the church because God called you together. God did this. Not you. Now, that's kind of subversive in our world today, in part because we think, and we often do, and we'll use this language. It's not wrong language, but we'll say things like, "I'm shopping for the church," shopping for a church. We'll use that language in a consumer culture in which we live in, as if the church is totally dependent on our choice. Because God knows we love the freedom of choice in our culture. And the assertion in 1 Peter is, yeah, that's part of it, but really what this is about is God chose you to be part of this community. God chose you to be in this particular community. So part of our celebration of the 25th anniversary is to celebrate those charter members who held up their hand and said, "I will be the church," but it's also to say to ourselves, look what God did, right? To marvel at what God did. and continues to do among us. Now, we need to remember that the church is not an idea, it's not a building, it's not a location. The church is you, folks, you people. 25 years ago and here today, you are the church, which means not simply you are the church here in these chairs and standing before the jazz band on Sunday morning, but you're the church every single day. Every day. Because the church is not a building or idea or location or even a worship service. The church is you, the people. And not just any kind of people, but a people who are shaped by a particular vision of who God is. And Randy's going to share a little bit here, and we recognize our charter members. Randy's going to share a little bit about kind of the defining features of Heartland Presbyterian Church, kind of our DNA, captured, we hope, in the phrase about our celebration here: love, justice, and all that jazz. That we are the kind of people who believe that. We are the kind of people who strive to do Micah 6:8. That has been the defining feature of this group of people: to do justice, to be loving, and to be humble about it all. That's not simply a group of people, that's what God's doing among us and with us and through us. So today is a celebration of those charter members, of our being a congregation, but it is also a big thank you to God for bringing that group of people together to shape the community, the people of God who we are today. Look what God did. Thanks be to God. Amen.